Turok is a textbook example of what I call a zombie franchise. While we've been getting solid remasters of the classic entries, I don't really see a new game being developed anytime soon. Even if you're a fan, I wouldn't be too upset about that because there have been so many games that take clear inspiration from the Turok style and other games surrounding it that there's no shortage of similar experiences. Night Dive may have completed the trilogy, but there's one game that, honestly, I don't blame them for skipping, but nonetheless has remained on its home platform. That being Turok Rage Wars, released in November of 1999 exclusively for the N64, and hear me out, this game might just act as the bridge between the PC shooter of the late 90s and the cross-platform shooter of the 2000s. Despite taking advantage of the expansion pack, the visuals of Rage Wars are pretty schizophrenic in terms of quality. I can easily say that even Turok 1 has more appealing environments and even UI design, yet the fidelity on the character models and weapons is pretty damn good. It can be jarring looking at some relatively bland maps, I'll go into further detail later, while simultaneously looking at a near PS2 looking view model. While this footage is obviously scaled up, even on real hardware, this game could run at 480p, which was kind of a big deal for a console back then. I'd say the sound is equally as inconsistent, and in like the exact same way too. Much like the arenas you're fighting in, the accompanying music is more in line with Quake than Unreal Tournament, as in it suits the setting but rarely gets your head moving. On the other hand, the sound effects are really impressive for the system standards. On some nice speakers, they really fill out the sound and make your weapons feel far more powerful than the animation might imply. Speaking of weapons, before we take a closer look at each one of them, notice how Rage Wars once again draws a mix of inspiration from the guys on PC. Like the original Quake Deathmatch mode, fallen players drop not weapons, but rather ammo packs. A strange choice at first, but then I realized that unlike most arena games of the time, standard weapons cannot be found just lying around the map. You know the loadout system of, I don't know, every AAA multiplayer shooter? Yeah, Rage Wars had that. I'm not claiming it's the first game to ever do this, I'm not nearly familiar enough with the history of multiplayer shooters to say, but it's certainly interesting that a game with such a mix of influence from the other side of gaming, so to speak, would employ such a different approach. Now, the lack of weapon pickups might have just been a result of limitation, but it's not like they couldn't have made the weapons simple icons or something. This was clearly a conscious decision. Despite all of this, the overall match flow isn't too far from that of any other arena shooter. You spawn in, get as much ammo as you can since your guns chew through it like crazy, and you look for the power-up. Yes, I said power up. Singular. Other than health pickups, the only item that affects your character in the way something like quad damage or armor would is the lone crystal placed somewhere in the map. Its effect is randomized. It can be a damage or health boost, regeneration, turning all of your weapons into a freeze ray, teleportation, etc. While the random nature of this item might not be for the more competitive players, I think the lack of guaranteed overpoweredness once acquired makes the matches less one-sided than a Quake deathmatch where one guy always secures the quad damage and is practically untouchable. This next thing might not necessarily have been taken from Unreal since the release dates are so close, but remember the Redeemer? That hard to find but match defining weapon? Well, Rage Wars has something of the sort. Some maps will feature support weapons. Most of them are stuff like turrets or traps, but one of them is the Cerebral Boar, returning from Turok 2. In a 1v1, this might as well be the Redeemer, since it's a near guaranteed kill. Okay, we can finally get to the core weapons themselves. They are split into 4 types: melee, bullet, energy, and explosives, with the color of ammo pickups corresponding to each. Your last resort melee weapon is the Warhammer. Think the hatchet from Quake, except you can charge it like the impact hammer from UT. I guess it's worth mentioning that, again, like Unreal, almost every weapon has a secondary firing mode. As for the real loadout, the Mag 60 is your standard hit scan burst fire pistol, which has a handy auto lock on alt fire. To keep that from being OP, you can't move while locking on. The shotgun is, well, a typical shotgun. Not quite as satisfying to shoot as any of id's double barrels, but its alt fire lets you charge a barrage of shots that can help if your opponent just won't sit still. The assault rifle's primary fire is pretty disappointing, not a lot of damage and a slow firing rate. Fortunately, tapping the B button greatly increases its rate of fire and actually makes it useful. Speaking of high rate of fire, the minigun is exactly what you would expect, although it has this alt fire reticle function that seems to activate a temporary shield at the cost of energy. I'd rather save that green ammo for the tech crossbow. If you've played Half-Life, you know what you're getting into, although with this game's map design, it's really not as useful as you would hope. The flare gun is similar to the bio rifle, in that it's not the best direct damage weapon, but instead it leaves behind these balls of radiation that shred through a health bar. I find this one a bit too risky to use often since it does just as much damage to you as it does to the bots. The freeze gun doesn't work how you'd expect. Instead of ice, it freezes your opponents like how the N64 would itself. What I mean is, whoever shot slows down to a crawl, giving you a chance to shoot them with something else. The inflator is basically a weaponized version of that pressure room from Unreal Tournament. Not really sure why it exists, other than maybe one of the visual artists figured out how to stretch meshes in real time and just had to show the rest of the team, so he bribed one of the weapon programmers. The plasma rifle is a rapid-fire version of the tech bow, although it also works kind of like the ASMD shock rifle. On the other hand, the Emancipator is like a super fast version of the shock rifle's alt fire. It can even charge just 2 shots of a powered up blast. The boomerang can ricochet both off walls and your opponents, with the potential to do some massive damage. The Scorpion is exactly what it looks like, a rocket launcher, although it has far less splash damage than what you might be used to. Same goes for the grenade launcher, which has an alt fire that's essentially a flak cannon. And finally, the napalm gel is kind of like Halo's Needler, in that its projectiles stick to a host and can be remote detonated. Much like the PC crowd, Turok Rage Wars offers a single-player mode that more or less functions as an introduction to the core gameplay before ditching that for the multiplayer mode. However, it's worth noting that unlike UT99, where you went through every map for every game type in order, or Quake 3's original PC release that was nothing but deathmatch, Rage Wars seems to have had about 2% more effort put into the setup for the solo mode. For one, each of the available playable characters has their own set of events, which I believe differ in difficulty. The first 3 matches will always be the same though, ending on a 1v1 against Bastel, this dickhead with the shield you have to destroy before you can do damage, and as I said a moment ago, weapons don't hold that much ammo here, so you better make your shots count. Anyway, once you're past that, nothing really gets too close in terms of difficulty. It really wouldn't be a game from 99 if its hardest challenge wasn't right at the start, now would it? As for the game modes, you've got standard and team deathmatch, capture the flag, which is more of a single flag CTF mode than a more typical one, and the standout, Tag the Monkey. In this mode, a player is randomly turned into any number of small animals, not just monkeys, and have to step on the glowing panel or find a box of bananas to turn back. You only score when you frag or tag the person who is it. Honestly, I appreciate the originality with this mode, but trying to aim at a small bastard running around with these controls is not something I'm a fan of. Much like the music, it seems Turok Rage Wars takes after Quake 3 more than Unreal Tournament in terms of its character skins. Rather than just a few basic species types with similar models, the characters you can play as and fight against range from humanoid to a raptor or even a ball of fleas. No, seriously, that's one of the skins. It's also interesting that each of the playable characters has their own default loadout, although the choice of weapons is ultimately up to you. The arena shooter community has this weird thing where only about 3 or 4 of the maps ever even end up getting played on, and if Rage Wars were a LAN-compatible PC title, then I'm sure the same would have happened here. Like I just did with the weapon selection, I want to give each of the 36 maps a very brief moment in the sun. Grim Retreat. You can get the cerebral bore on this one, but try not to fall into the pit right below the power-up crystal. Fallout. The crystal is not hard to find, although climbing those ladders to get to the health and explosives could prove risky. Bomb Shelter. This one's so spaghetti that me and the bot rarely ever see each other, yet somehow I was always able to get to the crystal first. Fire Temple. We're introducing lava hazards, and you're gonna have to do a bit of parkour to get to the crystal this time. The Pit. Obligatory Tron map, and it's not the last we'll see. I've never been a fan of the massive hole in the center type maps that every arena shooter had back then, although this map does have 2 power-up crystals, so the flow is quite a bit more frantic. Leap of Faith. One of the more vertical maps in the game, also introducing teleporters. I think it gets its name from the jump you have to make to get to the power-up crystal. Crypts. Lots of narrow pathways to climb, although the crystal isn't at the top like you'd expect it to be. Hopeless. This one gives me Half-Life vibes for some reason. The layout seems confusing at first, but it's actually very straightforward and access to the crystal is practically immediate. Proving Ground. Our first donut-style map, which makes it really easy to navigate, but also fairly uninteresting. Can we stop getting two maps back-to-back with the exact same tile sets? Basic Training. As the name would suggest, this one's very simple, just a central area with some outer paths that loop back around. Such a layout allows for a very smoothly flowing match. Amphitheater. One of the more open maps with a fairly interesting composition. Like a lot of the others, you've got a central area and outskirts, except this time the crystal requires you to scale the geometry to get to it, and there's a suspended bridge as a way to give yourself a height advantage. Tightrope. Go figure, the crystal spawns on a narrow path, although they should have made it narrower if walking across was supposed to be challenging. Tempered. Tons of lava hazards here. In a very unexpected move, some of the items, including the cerebral boar, are actually hidden within the lava, so there's a very heavy risk versus reward factor with this design. Warehouse. First map to use elevator platforms. A little odd considering you can climb ladders. I was expecting the crystal to be on top of the pile of boxes, but it's just in its own little area. Cathedral. One of the few maps where the crystal doesn't seem to spawn. Maybe this was the developer's intended competitive map, hence why they used it for the boss during the single-player trial mode. Crossroads. Easily one of my favorite maps thanks to its unique design. All of the ammo is on the bottom and the goodies are on top. There's a really great dichotomy between the zigzagging layout of the bottom section and the featureless top part. Earth Temple. For some reason, the team deathmatch maps are their own exclusive category, but I'm just gonna play them like regular deathmatch. Anyway, this map has one of those annoying deceptive jumps which you feel like you can make from anywhere, but you actually have to jump from a very specific point to get to the crystal. Breakdown. They really threw everything they had into this one. Lava, moving platforms, ladders, and teleporters. Honestly, it's not as exciting as it sounds. Matrix. I get it, this game came out in 1999. Most of this map is contained within anti-gravity water, so the pacing is really wonky. Spirit Temple. More anti-gravity water, except this time the underlying design is far more elaborate and engaging. Camping for the crystal is a little too easy though. Starlight. This map has a facing worlds thing going on, probably because it's one of the only maps within the actual skybox. I really enjoy the odd terrain here. Prey. Another put the crystal on a pedestal and you have to jump to it map. It's okay, not a lot going on underneath. Water Temple. The gimmick with this one is this green water that somehow drains your ammo. The underwater passages make it pretty easy to lose sight of your opponents. Wicked Dance. You really think they would have put the crystal in mid-air so you have to climb up to get it through the hole, just like how they did with Crossroads, but nope, it's just sitting there. The Pedestal. One of the better crystal in the center type maps. The oddly shaped and positioned pillars makes it fun to traverse. DEFCON 5. This is one of those loopable maps, if that makes sense. Getting the crystal requires you to take a very specific path that is just long enough to present a risk, and it's not so specific that you can't ever veer off for a bit if you spot your opponent. Courtyard. I like how the terrain sort of funnels you downwards and draws your attention to the ground where you're most likely going to be aiming, unless you're the monkey of course. Retaliation. Lots of winding staircases, also I couldn't seem to find the power-up crystal in this one. Bunker. I like the diversity of the layout, it kind of reminds me of an Unreal Tournament domination map. Box Set. There's a heavier emphasis on climbing here, the monkey antidotes are placed quite well. Mystic. There's this big non-lethal pit that I guess is supposed to make getting to the banana box harder. The angled staircases are fun when you gotta get to the antidote quickly. Fathom. Another map that slopes into the middle, this time with a water tunnel that has the crystal, bananas, and explosives. Dire Strait. Final stretch here. Just a reminder to capture the flag in Rage Wars only has one flag and plays out in a far less team-focused sort of way. As for Dire Strait, This map is literally a straight line. The crystal is very out of the way, and it's ultimately not worth the wasted time, since by the time you get to it, you'll probably be a point or two behind. Bottleneck. Another map with a great sense of back and forth momentum. The flag is on the top floor, which you teleport to, and then you make your way back down, hopefully with a chance to grab the crystal too. Firewalker. This one has 2 capture points right next to each other for some reason. Lots of lava for the AI to get stuck in too. Stronghold. The design for this one is really charming, how you have to run into this little hut to get to the flag, and the crystal is sitting on top of it. And that's every single map mentioned. If there's one thing that all of these maps have in common, it's their size. For a system known for its large open world collectathons and sprawling and honestly confusing FPS map layouts, it's quite surprising to me that Turok Rage Wars was this scaled back in terms of its map sizes. Yeah, system limitations and all that, but I don't think I've ever felt so claustrophobic in an arena shooter before. Some maps can open up a little bit, as I just spent quite a while describing, but others are barely the width of your character. Keep in mind that I generally prefer a more compact approach to level design in pretty much any genre. As I've gotten older, I've started to really not care for open world games with these giant maps. It's why I don't play the Onslaught or Warfare mode in the later Unreal Tournament games, or why I haven't played an open world racer since my last revisit of Most Wanted. I can definitely get behind Rage Wars maps more than Battlefield 2, for example, but I think the scale of something like Counter-Strike or hell, Quake 1 is perfectly fine. No matter how you slice it, Turok Rage Wars is one of those multiplayer games, and any single player content is practically a product of the time. You couldn't exactly hook up an N64 to the internet, at least without an adapter that I don't think ever came to the West. The inclusion of bots in these sorts of games today is still not exactly standardized. Some have them, some don't. Typically it's not a huge deal since, assuming the game in question has an active player base, you'd never have to fall back on bots in the first place. In a way, things now aren't too different to how they were in the mid-90s. Most multiplayer games simply didn't have bots. It wasn't until Unreal and Steve Polge's AI let the world know that you can in fact program a computer to present a realistic enough challenge in a deathmatch game. With the exception of maybe Duke 64, which I just recently found out had bots in its Duke match mode, for the most part, the multiplayer mode was outright disabled if you didn't have a second controller plugged in. By 1999, pretty much every PC shooter had some form of AI opponents, but again, on consoles that was rare. Then came the year 2000 and all of a sudden, you could play both Unreal Tournament and Quake Free on a console with bots and even a mouse and keyboard. When I called Turok Rage Wars a bridge between two eras, that's what I meant. It came out on a console a year ahead of that newfangled next generation and offered what most of its direct competitors couldn't. That's not to say that the bots are on the same level as Unreal Tournament, but they could still offer a decent challenge, although they certainly handle some maps better than others. When set to the highest difficulty, I feel that the AI sits in that sweet spot where it's not so easy that you don't get anything out of beating them, but not so hard as to feel cheap. Due to the very nature of Turok Rage Wars, I can only really label it a polished curiosity piece. I find its concept endearing and its execution impressive. I'm not going to tell you to drop everything and play it, unless of course you're like me and look at a video game less as just a means to kill time, but something to look at and compare to others of its kind. On that note, this still is one of the most solid multiplayer deathmatch experiences of the 5th console generation, and its single player accessibility should not go overlooked.